a land awash in oil, ruled by, well, a charismatic young revolutionary, right? Someone who promised the world but delivered, well, a really strange mix of progress and brutality.
A figure both admired and feared, his 42-year rule ending in a bloody climax that, continues to shape the region to this day. This is the story of Muammar Gaddafi.
And welcome to the deep dive, where we take your submissions and really extract the key insights, right? Today, we're diving deep into the life and death of Muammar Gaddafi, trying to understand the man, the myth, and the legacy.
You want to know how he rose to power?
What he did while in control.
And of course, the circumstances of his dramatic fall. So let's unlock this together.
All right. Before Gaddafi, what was Libya like? Paint a picture for us.
Okay, so before Gaddafi, Libya had been under the influence of, well, a bunch of different powers.
Okay.
Like, for centuries, it was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Then, you have Italian colonization in the early 20th century. And then after World War II, you have the French and the British kind of controlling things.
So a history of outside influence, right?
Exactly. Libya's destiny really shaped by external forces.
Makes sense. Okay, so 1951 rolls around. The UN grants Libya independence. King Idris becomes the monarch, right? And then, boom, oil is discovered in the late 50s.
Yeah, huge potential. Everyone's thinking prosperity, self-determination for Libyans, a brighter future.
Yeah, the promise of oil wealth, right. It must have felt like a turning point.
It did, initially. But as often happens with these resource-rich countries, the wealth wasn't shared equally.
Okay, so who benefited?
Mostly the foreign oil companies. They had these big concessions. So for the average Libyan, the promised prosperity didn't really happen.
So you have this growing frustration, people feeling like the nation's resources weren't really benefiting them.
Right.
Yeah.
And the monarchy, not really doing much for them. So you can imagine the stage was set for some serious change.
And enter Gaddafi, right.
Right.
1969. The king's on vacation, and bam, this young 27-year-old army colonel leads a coup, takes power, just like that. It's almost cinematic.
It is.
So who was this guy, this young revolutionary?
Well, Gaddafi, he was ambitious, definitely. He had a law degree, actually. And he was smart, no doubt. But his views, considered pretty radical even back then.
Radical how?
Well, he was expelled from some schools because of his politics, challenging the status quo, He formed this group, the Free Officers Movement.
Okay, so these were like-minded military men.
Exactly. All unhappy with the monarchy, sharing this vision for a new Libya.
And they pull off this coup. And Gaddafi's in charge for the next, 4 decades?
42 years.
Wow. And his rule, it's fascinating. It's like this contradiction, right?
In a way, yeah.
You have these social and economic reforms, the Green Revolution. What did that actually involve?
Okay, so the Green Revolution, it aimed to improve the lives of everyday Libyans. And in some ways, it did. They focused on essential services, clean water, free education, and healthcare for all citizens.
So basic necessities taken care of. That's a big deal, right?
It was. And they didn't stop there. They tried to redistribute wealth, empower the working class. They had this thing where workers could share in state profits.
Interesting. And they took some pretty bold actions.
Yeah. They confiscated assets from Italians and Israelis.
Wow.
And maybe most importantly, they nationalized the oil industry.
So taking back control of their most valuable resource.
Exactly. Putting it in the hands of the Libyan government, at least in theory.
Right. So they're making changes. And according to some reports, living standards improved, crime went down, class differences narrowed.
Right. They also supported agriculture, helped people get housing. Things were looking up, for a while at least.
It sounds like Gaddafi was genuinely invested in the well-being of Libyans.
On the surface, maybe. But there's another side of this story. A much darker side.
That's what makes him so intriguing, right? This duality.
Exactly. While he was making these changes at home, his actions on the world stage, they were something else entirely.
Okay, so internationally, what was Gaddafi doing?
Well, he was supporting all these anti-Western groups, some of them considered terrorist organizations by the West.
Okay.
He backed dictators in neighboring countries, got involved in regional conflicts, and then, of course, there's the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction.
Which obviously made a lot of countries nervous, especially the U.S.
Absolutely. The U.S. accused Gaddafi of planning attacks against President Reagan, even involvement in the 1986 Berlin bombing.
Right. And then the U.S. bombed his residence in Tripoli.
Yeah, a really tense period. And tragically, there were civilian casualties,
Right.
including Gaddafi's adopted daughter.
A turning point for sure. But then what's really surprising is that later, he kind of changes course.
It's true. He stops the WMD programs, stops supporting terrorism, even lets foreign oil companies back in. A complete 180.
Like he realized he needed to play a different game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Had to adapt to survive. It shows, a certain pragmatism.
And it leads to this strange alliance with the West after 9/11.
Yeah, former enemies working together against a common threat. Politics makes strange bedfellows, right?
It really does. But even while he's trying to smooth things over internationally, back home, the problems are still there.
Oh, absolutely. Human rights, political freedom, those issues are still unresolved.
And then you have these stories about Gaddafi's personal life.
Oh yeah, the eccentricities. They almost overshadow the darker aspects of his regime.
It's like something out of a movie.
Right. Shark pools, bulletproof tents, a female bodyguard unit, the Amazonian Guard.
The Amazonian Guard! Amazing. Food tasters because he was afraid of being poisoned.
So much paranoia. He refused to use elevators, wouldn't climb above the 35th stair.
Really? Why?
Who knows? He had his own set of rules. And then you have these rumors of private concerts by big-name artists.
Like world-famous musicians?
Supposedly. And even family feuds over, of all things, Coca-Cola.
Coca-Cola.
Yeah, they had some disagreements about Coke's operations in Libya. It shows how his control extended to every aspect of life.
And Gaddafi himself, he was known for making some pretty strange statements.
Oh yeah, some bizarre pronouncements. He said something about Coca-Cola being good for Africa, which makes no sense.
So he's increasingly seen as this erratic figure.
Right, and his appearance changed drastically over time. Lots of cosmetic surgery, apparently.
But we can't let these eccentricities distract us from the real issues.
Agreed. The darker side of his regime can't be ignored.
We're talking about torture, censorship, allegations of rape, terrible abuses by his security forces.
And it's particularly disturbing when you consider his stance on women's rights.
Right. It's this weird contradiction. He advocated for women's education, encouraged them to work.
Which, in a conservative society, could be seen as progressive.
But at the same time, he maintained these patriarchal systems, and there were these horrifying reports of sexual abuse, even within his Amazonian Guard.
It's like he was using progressive ideas as a shield while terrible things were happening behind the scenes.
It's all about control, right? Any dissent was crushed, opponents were silenced, or worse. There were secret prisons, child soldiers. It's a dark chapter.
It is. And then, in 2010, you have the Arab Spring.
This wave of protests across the Middle East and North Africa.
And it hits Libya hard. People demanding change, an end to Gaddafi's rule.
And his response? Brutal. He calls the protesters cockroaches, orders them to be eliminated, no room for compromise.
None at all. This crackdown, it basically ends any goodwill he had left internationally.
Those alliances he built after 9/11, gone.
Gone. And this time, the world reacts.
A coalition forms, including the U.S., Italy, France, the U.K. They support the Libyan opposition.
And it leads to military intervention. The balance of power shifts.
The Battle of Tripoli in 2011, Gaddafi's regime collapses, and then his capture and death.
A dramatic end for a man who once held so much power.
It was shocking. Those images of his final moments broadcast everywhere. The end of an era.
But the debate about his legacy, that continues.
Right. It's complicated. Some world leaders remember him with fear because of his support for terrorism, his unpredictable nature.
But others, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, might remember him differently.
As a champion against colonialism, a symbol of Arab unity.
His supporters claim he was a visionary leader, that the 2011 uprising was orchestrated by the West to seize Libya's oil.
They downplay the human rights abuses or deny them altogether.
But then you have the other side.
The people who saw him as a ruthless dictator, who used Libya's oil wealth for his own gain.
They point to the repression, the corruption, the missed opportunities for democracy.
It's two very different perspectives.
And reactions to his death reflect that divide. Some celebrated, others mourned.
And what's even more tragic is what happened to Libya after he was gone.
Yeah, the promise of a new, democratic Libya, it hasn't materialized.
Instead, there's been chaos, conflict, rival factions fighting for control.
A lot of casualties, people displaced from their homes, the economy's in shambles.
It makes you wonder, was it all worth it?
It raises serious questions about intervention, about the unintended consequences of regime change.
So this deep dive into Gaddafi's life and death, it's a story of contradictions.
He was a revolutionary who brought some progress, but also ruled with an iron fist.
A complex figure who left behind a legacy that's still debated today.
It makes you think about power, about the motivations behind interventions, about the unforeseen fallout of removing a leader.
Gaddafi, hero or villain? Maybe neither, maybe both. His story is a cautionary tale, for sure.
It leaves us with more questions than answers. And that, I think, is the most intriguing part of it all.
Subscribe and give me a like.